Hello, today I'm going to be painting this colourful abstract landscape painting on my iPad in Procreate, and I've started with a simple sketch, not paying too much attention to accuracy. I'm just trying to block some basic shapes out. In Procreate I use the selection tool with colour fill on to do the big shapes, and I simply blast in the few shapes following the simple sketch below. Once I have the block-ins on each layer, I start to use the color fill tool again, and I will put detail on in very rough shapes, trying to follow where the sun's coming from. So the sun's coming from the top left, so I'm careful to make sure everything is kind of angled the right way. One thing to pay attention to when creating the light and shadow areas is to make sure the shadow areas are not just completely dark. You can still see some detail in them. So I'm still making the shapes, so I'll go back and forth making these shapes throughout the painting. And one thing to keep in mind where the sun is coming from, you want to make sure you keep some really dark parts so you get a dramatic effect between the light and dark areas. And so you can see here I'm putting in the highlight of the grass, which is very pronounced, and that's on purpose to make it look more interesting. So with this style I'm not doing any shading, so it will look more dramatic anyway because of the lack of shading. You could smooth these out if you wanted a more realistic look, but I prefer kind of the vector look is what we're getting here without actually doing vectors, which takes a lot longer and is a bit more restrictive. So I'm still doing pretty much the same simple little process I do all over the place, which is putting down basic shapes using the color fill tool. I like to use that because it gives very sharp edges, and it's a little bit more difficult when you're using brushes to do that. So I'm still each on separate layers to get all these shapes down, and then I'll go over the top of these shapes again with generally the highlights. So most of the time you'll see me just go lighter. Earlier I put these big shapes in for the trees, so when I do trees I put them in big bunches usually, and then I'll use the eraser tool to make them look a bit more interesting and add a few gaps through the middle so you can see behind. That's quite important to give the painting depth, is to make sure you have holes through trees and things like that. So again, this is nothing new, this is the same as before. So I've got the alpha lock on these rocks so I can put the highlights, and the same for pretty much every layer. You can use alpha lock to make sure the colors go onto the correct layer. And I'm putting in some trees here. Again, I don't try and paint the trees accurately, I'm just trying to suggest them, and I do that using, so when I'm using a bit more smaller details, I'm using the technical pen in Procreate, which is just in the inking section, and I use that brush when I need to go a bit smaller, and the color fill is a bit hard to do when things get really small. And I use this tool quite a lot, so even when it gets fairly small I can do it, but that's just because I'm used to it. You'll find that when you start going small it's hard to hit that little dot, so you need to hit that little grey dot to fill in the area that you've selected. Now sometimes if it's really small it's quite hard to hit that dot, so I do suggest using a brush, but any brush will do. But if you want to do this kind of style, you need a hard brush. The soft brush will make everything look kind of out of focus, and we don't want that. So one thing to note for these trees, I'm putting in some highlights again. The sun's coming from the top left. I'm using the technical pen still. It's the only brush I use for this style of painting, and you don't need to use other brushes there. But one thing to be careful of with these trees, that especially these big old dark trees, their highlights are still very dark on the leaves. The leaves are generally, not all the time, but they're generally dark, especially green trees. So make sure you don't over highlight those, which is quite easy, and I used to do that in the past all the time. I wanted nice bright trees and I used to use really bright greens or yellows, and it just looked weird. So keep in mind whatever the shape is you're drawing or filling in, sorry, is not too bright compared to what is underneath. So if it's very dark underneath, the highlights are going to be dark. So don't always think highlights are bright. They're not. Sometimes highlights are quite dark. It's just because the actual color underneath is really dark, so they can still look bright. So it's all about getting a trick between the light and dark, and not just picking light colors all the time. A mistake I used to make a lot. So this section on the left is very dark as well, because it's in shadow. So the sun's coming from the top left and it can't really get around. You still have ambient light, meaning it's just coming from the sky. So it's not going to be completely black. But we need to make sure I don't over highlight that section down in the left. And I probably could have knocked it back a bit and made it a bit darker. And so I'm fiddling about with the sky and making it a bit darker. I use the alter tools, the hue, saturation, brightness in Procreate quite a lot. I don't overthink what colors I want to use. I just get it roughly right. But because my simple process of the big shapes is on each layer, I can use the adjust tool to get the shape into the color I want, and then I'll put over the top different colors. So I'll tweak those throughout the painting, and even towards the end I'll change it. And sometimes I change every single color and every single layer if I don't like the color scheme. So color can be quite tricky to get right, of course, and one thing nice about any app, Procreate's got nice tools for changing the colors after the fact. So I tend not to get too worried early on about that, and just go with what seems right. So I'm coming towards, the detail stage now, and I'm just looking at the painting and trying to see where I can add more detail to make it look more interesting. So I'll put some clouds in. Very simple here. I just use the color fill shape again. Now, one thing I am using this time is the smudge tool in Procreate, the little hand up the top right, and basically just smudge it in and get rid of most of it, basically, so it just looks like nice wispy little clouds. And so towards the end I put in some effects, which is generally on the softer side. So using the smudge tool, it can soften out, and if you turn the opacity of the layers down, we have some nice simple effects to make it look a bit more interesting. And so just some final details here. The details do matter, otherwise it'll look a bit blank, and you can add as much or as little as those that you like. But that's about it. If you liked it, give me a like and sub, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.